Good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed a very great pleasure to welcome Sri Gopal Subramaniam as the speaker for this afternoon's lecture. This is part of the Delhi University lecture series, a series at which we invite very eminent speakers and we request them to deliver a lecture which will be of interest to students across the various disciplines. Just to recapitulate some of the speakers who have been addressing the gathering in the university lecture series, we've had the Nobel laureate, Professor Jules Hoffman. We also had Dr. Atarur Rahman, who's the UNESCO Science Laureate, who spoke to us last year. And much further down in the geography of the world, we had Professor Aditya Malik, all the way from New Zealand, a social anthropologist, to speak to the gathering almost a year ago. It's indeed a very, very great privilege to welcome Sri Gopal Subramaniam today. He, in a way, belongs to Delhi University, having taken a law degree from here. And over the years, he has kept up a very vital link with the university, and in the last half an hour or so has been sharing many of his warm stories about his connection with this university and his love of the campus and his great vision of what education can do. I would request Professor Dinesh Singh to give Mr. Gopal Subramaniam a gift of the university calendar as a memento for his being with us this afternoon. That Mr. Gopal Subramaniam is now a visiting professor to the University of Delhi. He has very kindly accepted the invitation from the Vice Chancellor and the University. He will be primarily associated with the Cluster Innovation Center, but already the word has gone around and there are requests coming from the law faculty and from many others who know of his presence in the campus. So, Mr. Subramaniam, I'm sure you'll have a very, very busy year in the university. I request Vice Chancellor, Professor Dinesh Singh, to introduce the speaker and to chair the session.
Mr. Subramaniam, colleagues and students, I am delighted to be present once again for this special lecture series that Professor Malarshi Lal spoke about. We've had many eminent speakers in the past, and it is always nice for a university to keep arranging such events at regular intervals of time, because there's a special purpose they serve. This is in many ways an occasion for renewal of our thought processes, to bring a certain freshness of ideas. A university will never be a university unless there is a certain churning of the mind. And who better to be present here today to make us think and churn the thoughts of the mind a little bit than Mr. Gopal Subramaniam. I have followed his career from afar, never realizing that one day our paths would come together in some sense. I followed his career with admiration. I followed his career with a degree of satisfaction that things are not always wrong in this country, that there is always reason for hope. And that is what would have been expected of someone with the pedigree of Mr. Subramaniam. It isn't law that makes him what it is. It's partly a certain tradition that has been embedded in his DNA. His grandfather was a great educationist who was responsible for introducing the modern school system in Tamil Nadu and ensuring that some of the modern ideas and practices that were also associated with liberalism were put into practice there. His father was faculty in our own faculty of law, appointed long ago with two other extremely eminent jurists, Professor Tripathi and Professor Lotika Sarkar. So is it any surprise that Mr. Gopal Subramaniam chose, before he accepted positions at Harvard and other places, chose to accept our own humble offering and became a visiting professor? What was it that I admire in him? What was it that made me draw satisfaction from afar? I am a mathematician. You could well ask, what makes a mathematician think about jurisprudence and law? Why should I dwell on these matters? But tell me, which realm of human endeavor is not affected by law? Where is it that law does not touch us? And it would be a sad day when anyone in this land decides that henceforth this is my boundary and beyond that I do not care. But you know, there is something special about law. There is something so extraordinary that we must pay heed to this. It is law and all that flows from it that allows, engenders, encourages all other acts and actions of human society. And woe betide that nation, that society, where the laws become strange, or they alienate the people, or they harm humankind. And how does one safeguard from such dangers? There is nothing that flows from the starry heavens above and is embedded in here. It is all the creation of humans. So it is up to humans to ensure that these systems stay alive and serve the larger purpose beyond the narrow confines of what is called a court or a classroom. And that's where the human intervention, the human factor, becomes so extraordinarily important. Fortunately for us in India, we've had a great tradition, at least from modern times, when modern constitutional Western law began to be introduced in India under the influence of the British. We've had great jurists, great scholars of jurisprudence. I can think of Nani Palkhiwala. I do not know how many of the young ones really remember or know much about him. But if there is a certain fundamental freedom that is guaranteed us today as ordinary citizens, Palkhiwala played a huge role when he defended the same in the famous Keshavanand Bharti case. In exactly the same way, there were others. I do not know if the young ones are aware. But so many of our freedom fighters were extraordinary scholars and practitioners of law. So many of them. And at this point in time, I would just like to highlight one. And there's a reason why. I will come to my point. When Netaji Subhash Bose's army eventually, when the Japanese surrendered and his own army, after his tragic demise, had to surrender, the British put to trial 3 of the eminent leaders of that army at the Red Fort. And this was a huge challenge and affront for us as Indians. And it was but as it should have been that the leading lights of the freedom movement, Jawaharlal Nehru, Rajan Babu, Sardar Patel, all of them gathered in their legal robes to defend these freedom fighters. The point I want to draw your attention to is that the real defense was led by an extraordinary person of law, Bhulabhai Desai, whose name we may not remember now. There is a road named after him in Mumbai. Rajan Babu, who was also an extremely successful lawyer and a gifted scholar, writes in his autobiography that the arguments that Bhulabhai Desai put forward can match the best arguments of the best courts of the world. He said that it is a natural legal right for a nation to defend himself by those means that it can adopt for its own freedom. Exactly echoing what Tilak had said. Swaraj hamara janma siddha adhikar hai, hum usko lekar rahenge. That was exactly that. I would urge the young students of law and others to read the arguments of Bhulabhai Desai. Unfortunately, I understand that now modern requirements do not allow us the freedom maybe to go forward and delve into many side paths, but it will bring nothing but enlightenment. So I mentioned Nani Palkhiwala, I mentioned Bhulabhai Desai. I would like to mention one more name. There are so many. I would like to mention K.M. Munshi. And I would urge young scholars and students of law to look at a small book that K.M. Munshi authored, Reminiscences of the Bombay High Court. Do read that, and you will understand what I'm trying to convey to you. That will be conveyed far better. There have been others. There's a long list of luminaries. What I would like to tell you is that Mr. Gopal Subramaniam is in the same caliber and class. I could highlight all his achievements, starting from his student days. The youngest senior advocate in the history of the Supreme Court, an extraordinary achievement by itself. I could also highlight so many other things, that he was also mentored in so many ways by the redoubtable Soli Sorabji, a fearless law person. There were so many things. But I'd like to try and bring to your attention something very, very special about Mr. Subramaniam that actually made him my hero. You know, we all talk about the law, and we'll get into technicalities, and we did this and that happened, and therefore this was allowed and that happens. And you can do a million things. You can mess around with the Constitution also. And we are in danger sometimes. If you look at the short history of independent India, you can understand that dangers lurk all the time. And how do you get out of these dangers? How do you protect a nation? How do you protect civil society? The only way you can do that is when you adhere to the moral law. All other acts of law can be put to good purpose only when you adhere to the moral law. And Mr. Subramaniam, in recent times, has fearlessly given all his scholarly insights, given all his wisdom, given all his knowledge. He would not have been my hero had he not also adhered in the strongest way to the moral law. That has been demonstrated so recently by him in so many ways in our national discourse. And therefore, sir, I have nothing but to tell you that we are honored that you are here today, and we await with eagerness your lecture. Welcome.
Professor Dinesh Singh, Professor Malashri Lal, Professor Ashwini Bansal, the Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor Sudesh Pachauri, Dr. Shankaran. I think I'm able to see Professor Ved Kumari at the back. And the galaxy of my friends. I use the word galaxy somewhat consciously because it was extraordinary to watch a mathematician speak about the greatest figures in law. And he spoke about them as if he had just met them the other day. He spoke about Professor K.M. Munshi, whose work, A Pilgrimage to Freedom, is a must for everyone to read. He spoke about Nani Palkhiwala, and I remembered how, as young lawyers, we all trotted from the Delhi University to hear Nani Palkhiwala, and how in the visitor's box we sent out our prayers that the Constitution must not be permitted to be amended again. Dr. Singh spoke about Jawaharlal Nehru, and I will have something to say about him in the course of our interaction today. He spoke about the great Bhulabhai Desai. Bhulabhai Desai was, of course, one of the most outstanding legends of the Indian bar, and a man with great conviction. And lawyers with great conviction must never be bothered about stones flying at them. Bhulabhai Desai, of course, as a young lawyer, used to make copious notes. He was very fond of making notes. I'm still fond of making notes. And sometimes they run into so many, many pages that I forget where did I start and where did I end. He once met an English lawyer called John Inverarity. And Bhulabhai Desai asked John Inverarity, "Sir, I request you to look at page 14. He said, "From where are you talking about page 14? He said, "Sir, I've got my notes." "Notes?" "Yes, sir, I've got plenty of them." "Plenty?" "Give them to me." And he tore them up. And he said, "Remember, if you want to be a great lawyer, you should read the brief and never make a note." From that day, Bhulabhai Desai, as Settleworth recounts, never made a note. And he knew exactly on what page was a particular line or sentence. Now, some of this can be almost mystical, but it gets passed on in any profession, in any tradition. Later, there was a great lawyer in Allahabad, Mr. Jogendranath Chowdhury. His grandson happened to be a finance minister in Sachin Chowdhury's, that is, Mr. Sachin Chowdhury in Jawaharlal Nehru's cabinet. He was a barrister, and he told my mother, "I make no notes. I follow Bhulabhai Desai." So there is something, Dr. Singh, in what you spoke about as the ineffable essence in our society, tradition, and profession. There is something. It is dynamic, it is contagious, it is capable of transmission. But it is very important to know that this is not simply a mystical quality about which we are talking. It has far more of a definitive premise, or shall we say, a frame, about which I'm going to talk to you about. All great lawyers in India, and again, it has completely fascinated me that a mathematician spoke about that as the most important dimension which is the moral impulse. It is an absolutely amazing insight. I really thought that it is lawyers who actually can discern this as the most outstanding part of a profession. But a mathematician seeing this very quickly, it tells you that how superior is mathematics to law. It's clear that Professor Dinesh Singh has mastered all the equations of law. But let's come to the moral essence which he spoke about. And I'm going to just narrate 3 or 4 small incidents. They were moving incidents, and then move on to the subject which we have to talk about. It is a very important subject. It is a subject of contemporary importance to civil society and, above all, the harbingers of the future, which is this university. I must make a very frank statement. I owe my career to my teachers at the Delhi University. I dedicate my success to the great teachers of the Delhi University, and I would completely acknowledge the extraordinary contribution made by the teachers in the law faculty at whose feet I studied. I see Professor Ved Kumari sitting at the back there, but it is characteristic of a law teacher usually to be sometimes a very quiet observer and analyze the various paradigms which are in a discourse. Very typical and very characteristic, because law is all about perspective. If you want to gain perspective, you can only do so by means of some framework. Now, we all are taught different frameworks in a university. Some can view knowledge through the prism of psychology. Some can gain insights through the science of mathematics, physics, chemistry, botany, zoology, any of the sciences. Some of us actually gain an insight through history. Some of us gain insight through political theory. But you will find that all of them, all disciplines, have a law about them. And now we will begin first with what is called the reverberating refrain of law in almost all branches of knowledge, into what we will come to as law in the theoretical and concrete context in a society. The law of evolution, the law of gravity, the law of E is equal to mc square, the law of, shall we say, the human genome, which is discovered with its fantastic possibilities of change, the sheer dynamism of research, the great internet revolution which gives you access to places, to ideas, to people, to their written word, to the spoken word, and also the ability to listen to music on the side sometimes. The important thing we all need to understand is that unless we have a framework to judge ourselves and to be in relationship with other people, and also somebody who is very external in our society, that is the state, for that purpose we need the law. And law provides you the tool of understanding. But this tool of understanding is not exclusive. This tool of understanding can be easily enriched by an allied science like psychology. It can be enriched by a knowledge of sociology. It will definitely be enriched by an understanding of political history. It will also be enriched by understanding the conflicts in our society which are based on products of history and class struggle. I find it somewhat hilarious that modern writers have freely bid farewell, shall we say, to Marxian scholars without realizing that the tremendous contribution which they made was to provide a construct for understanding our own society. And I will show you a little later that it was that construct which brought about the synergies required for an independent India. Sometimes it may be relevant, it may lose its relevance, it may need modification, it may need, shall we say, a fresh look, but all this is a process of dynamic change and evolution. But which is that discipline which makes it all possible? It happens to be law. It is law which is able to bring about that fundamental change. Now, let me give you just a quick snapshot of history and then move over to law and the Constitution. Of course, I had prepared a written text as well, which I will circulate, but I'm so enthused by the sheer sparkling presence of all of you and the tremendous introduction given by the Vice-Chancellor that I'm going to actually keep this aside and speak from my own conviction, from my bones, and hope that I'm able to connect to your heart and to your being. I want my words to evoke in you a sense of connectivity, and hopefully you may disagree, and I would welcome disagreement. I would actually be delighted if you could disagree with me. But I want to be connected, and that connection must take place through this topic today, which is called law. When we were oppressed under the British, it was actually a few strident individuals who could forecast the future. It's very ironic, one of them happened to be Annie Besant. But it is Annie Besant who wrote the first bill. When I saw her first bill, again, as a constitutional historiographer, and I hope Professor Bansal and Professor Shankaran and Professor Ved Kumari don't mind if I can make a claim for a few minutes to that position. When I looked at that bill, they spoke about free compulsory education in India. In which year? 1895. They spoke about equality of sexes. In which year? 1895. They spoke about equality before the law. In which year? 1895. Then we had a Commonwealth of India bill. Then we have the Simon Commission. Then we have the Quit India movement. And at last, after so many years of effort, and mind you, India having contributed in the First War, the Second World War for Britain, we were little concerned between Britain and Germany, but our people gave up their lives without consent. That war involved India. And it was the 6 provinces, Northwestern Province, the province of United Provinces, which all passed a resolution condemning that how could you involve us in a war without the people's consent? Ultimately, we were driven to assert that we don't want any external authority to frame our constitution. We are not exactly unintelligent. We know how to draft a constitution. And by that time, our Constitution founders had already done magnificent research of all the constitutions, including the Swiss constitution. I'm afraid today Switzerland is known more for bank accounts, but in those days it was known for its constitution, the rigorous constitution. People looked at the German constitution, the Swiss constitution, the continental constitutions, and by that time, our founding fathers were aware that if a society needed to be protected, individuals must first be protected. Annie Besant calls in one of her clauses, "A home shall be an inviolable asylum for every individual." Amazing. A home shall be an inviolable asylum. And these were the driving forces why we wanted a constituent assembly. But there were two important driving forces which I need to speak to you about. The first is people must have freedom. People must have freedom for what? To be able to speak. But even what further? To be able to develop. To be able to overcome the handicaps of human existence. For that you need freedom. Therefore, one of the driving forces was the liberal conception of freedom, which meant that there would be a snapping of the chains between the control over labor in the Marxian construct. That was one of the factors which was working with the founding fathers. The second was that it's just not enough to get freedom. We need to have a society where people who are marginalized, who are below the poverty line, and of course they really meant a real line, not a line which vanishes quickly now, but they meant a real line. That is, they meant that the poor must be emancipated from their conditions. And the first thing they did was, they were far-sighted in two things. One, the 31 Karachi session said secularism. And that's a very important value in our constitutional history. Secularism does not mean only tolerance of all religions, but secularism in our context is a more proactive position for both civil society and the state. And sometimes I wonder that do our constitutional subtleties have to be recognized by an archbishop in England? But yes, if you look at Rowan Williams' chapter on secularism and faith, you will understand the very important and poignant message which he conveys about the nature of Indian secularism being not only that you have a state which is scientifically based, which is completely neutral to all religions, but at the same time protects the freedom of practice of religion in the space of the boundary which is meant to be given by the Constitution. But the second aspect is equally important, which is socio-economic rehabilitation. And for that purpose, Parliament had power. For that purpose, Parliament thought that let us use the traditional Marxian model of taking over the landholdings of the big landlords and give them to the poor. You had voluntary movements like Bhudan by Acharya Vinoba Bhave and Jayaprakash Narayan, but at the same time, the thought was that we must actually progress towards looking after the marginalized people. And that is an abiding concern in the Constitution. And I want to first tell you that if law means anything to us, it must mean the same to a person who is advantageously placed in education or society and a person who is physically disabled or mentally ill or disadvantageously placed in society. That is equality of law. Equality of law is not equality among equals. Equality of law is about equality between citizens who are placed unequally by the very historical development of our society. And therefore, how did the Constitution actually fashion this development in the socio-economic sense? They knew that the first important belligerent attack which had to be made was against untouchability. Can two human beings who are actually human beings, there's nothing to distinguish them, nothing, and yet one shall not touch the other, yet one shall spurn away the other? They enacted Article 17, abolition of untouchability, as a fundamental principle in our Constitution. But the reason why we had Article 17 was to enable caste to become increasingly irrelevant by greater and greater social assimilation, which had to be encouraged by the state. But what has the state done in reality? The state has used the divisive factors which existed prior to the independence being achieved, prior to the drafting of the Constitution. Those very regressive factors have been replayed in our society over and over and over again. And this is where we need to liberate our society from the clutches of what is not only Secularist thought, but please remember, the historically divisive thought which kept us back from independence. So remember, you may have gathered independence with the sheer brow of your left hand, but you may be giving away that independence without your knowledge by subconscious attitudes and lack of awareness of responsibilities under the law. To feel equal, to treat somebody as an equal, requires a certain spiritual commitment and energy. And I'm not using the word spiritual in the mumbo-jumbo sense at all. I'm using it in the sense of the spirit of the Constitution. And please remember that our Constitution is one of the most rational constitutions of the world. The South African Constitution, they borrowed heavily from our Constitution. Some of us were associated with the drafting of some of the clauses of that Constitution, and we know how much the non-violent movement meant to them. If Truth and Reconciliation by Desmond Tutu could be such a great successful experiment of emancipation of hatred, it was possible because they looked at India and they saw that Indian people actually took blows on their body for the sake of freedom, for their citizens, for their fellow citizens. They were able to sustain suffering. Are we today able to sustain even a moment's suffering if we are overtaken by somebody driving past us on the right-hand side or the left-hand side? So to practice equality, to accommodate in your consciousness the existence of other people as equals, involves a dynamic change inside you. You will feel uncomfortable. You will feel different. It is easier said than done. I had the great privilege of meeting Achyut Patwardhan, again an extraordinary man, It was in the Theosophical Society in his last years in Madras. And I sat at his feet and I asked him that, what do you really mean, sir, by the word equality? He said, equality implies self-negation. I just wrote it down. I didn't understand it. I just did not understand what he meant. He just said equality means self-negation and left it at that. But after a few years, the wisdom of this statement, slowly, imperceptibly, all truths don't dawn on you like that. You need to have an open heart for that truth to be able to work its magic and reveal itself to you. And I realized it is true. It is only when you are able to accommodate another person with his foibles, with his manners, with his weaknesses, with his character, in a non-judgmental way, that you can actually practice equality. But if you allow that very clever trigger in our mind and brain, which is judgment, I have to judge. Before the man speaks, I have to judge. Before the man says a word, I have to judge, because I am actually the supreme of the supreme. This is a part of a certain subconscious mind which has to be dismantled by equality. If someone knew what true equality was, he would just not play God. There is no need for anybody to say that, look, I'm so sorry, I have to actually live with so many political compulsions in society, because, after all, we have to survive, and if you have to survive, then you have to survive with people of all kinds. This is again a certain self-inflicted sense of superiority. You just take one principal equality from the Constitution and you start looking at it through multifarious dimensions. You will find, my God, who actually drafted this Constitution? And you just need to look at the preamble. We don't have to go to 14, 19, 21, 32, 226, 136, 324, and of course now we have constitutional amendments, so you have a capital A also in between. But just look at the fundamental values of the preamble: dignity of the individual, social, political, and economic justice. All of them obviously are possible only if you practice equality and secularism. Without secularism, you cannot get either social justice or, for the matter of fact, political justice or economic justice, because it is really, a constitution is that great. It is not equivalent to an electroconvulsive therapy for a schizophrenic, but it is a very powerful instrument to dissect and emancipate in your mind the crustaceans which are formed over years on account of lack of understanding and lack of awareness of equality. When you look at a second facet, justice, what does this word justice mean? Does justice really mean that if somebody is assaulting you, you need to stop the car immediately and make sure that you give him a couple of blows back? What does justice actually mean? And you'll be surprised to know that people who are purportedly very highly civilized and educated, they don't mind freely flexing their arms if they have to give what is called short-arm justice. They find it easier, they find it they find it easy. But that is not the idea of justice we're talking about. For the purpose of justice, we're looking at justice where an individual is subjected through a process. We are looking at justice as a process. And it is this process which has not only the capacity of restoring your dignity, it is the capacity to heal you. It is the capacity to make you see truth. That is justice. People forget that it is the process which is as important and as necessarily to be understood as the final outcome of justice. If one were to know that law and justice are psychological tools, they're not really a book of articles in a constitution. These are fundamental tenets of human life and behavior. If people got together after the Nirbhaya incident and held hands together and lit candles, they did so, but they did so why? Because they wanted a process. And what was that process? People think that they wanted justice for the departed victim and their parents. No, there was also something more. They wanted, in some sense, justice for themselves. Because with the death of a citizen like Nirbhaya, something in each one of us has diminished. And it was necessary to hold hands to recuperate that sense of collective loss. That is equality. That is equality. When the bereavement of someone whom you've never seen, you've never spoken to, who has never actually walked with you, talked to you, but the loss of that person moves you so profoundly that people connect with each other. Yes, it was a clamor for reform of the law, but how could law reform even take place? Because there was this dynamic moment, this sociologically, if I may say so, potential energy, which was manifest in communing with each other over the loss of a human being in tragic circumstances. Now imagine if so many people could come together and feel alike together, and feel together, and think together, and actually bring about an energy together. How was it possible? Was it only the humanistic spirit? Yes, in a certain sense, of course, but more fundamentally, it was the sense of justice. The sense of justice being a consequence of the denial of equality. And what is the denial of equality? The denial of life. Doesn't that person have a chance, have a duty, have every possible statistical probability that that person should live like you and me? Why should that girl be picked up in a bus? Why should a person who is poor, a child who is begging in front of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences asking for money, be picked up by a policeman, put in a van, taken to a magistrate outside Lajpat Nagar, from where he is transported into one of the detention centers close to the Kingsway camp? Why? That is why law is so important. Unless and until you are able to see suffering, understand pain, understand loss through the eyes of equality, you will never feel the tremendous momentum of the law, which is equality, which is about justice, which is about fraternity. Now, this word fraternity is a very special word. And you will find that not many constitutional commentators have commented on this expression, fraternity. But the word fraternity was very calculatedly put in the preamble. The reason being The fathers who drafted the Constitution were aware of the communal vote. They were aware of the nature of divisive electorates. They wanted a society where people not only harmoniously lived with each other, but who embraced each other as a part of a society. It was a proactive constitution. Now, these are the precepts. Let us go further. What does then the Constitution contemplate? There is something called the state. The state is supposed to consist of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The executive is supposed to be an important component of the Constitution, because it is the executive which is supposed to ensure and protect you against oppression. It is the executive which is supposed to ensure that you have your fundamental freedoms. It is the executive which is supposed to be your facilitator to enjoy the possibilities of full development of the self. You need facilitative conditions. You need spaces, which is why in one of the recommendations in the Bill of Rights in the Justice Verma Committee, we spoke about spaces for women. That's because all of us need spaces. We're not talking only about physical spaces. We are talking about spaces. We're talking about spaces which are an inviolable asylum. Should you be punished because you have a different view? Should you be punished because you have a different gene in your DNA? Should you be punished because you're darker than some other people? Should you be punished because you belong to a certain region? Should you be treated with bias? The word punish is actually the extreme word, but the intermittent word, short of punishing, is bias. And how do you actually remove that bias? That bias needs to be removed from the executive. The bias needs to be removed from the legislature. The bias needs to be removed from the judiciary, everyone. It's a collective effort. But a constitution is that wonderful document by which there is political empowerment. Now, this word political, please understand, means also personal empowerment. The first step is personal empowerment. If you're not personally empowered, you will never be socially empowered. And that personal empowerment, which is that antecedent step to social empowerment, can be achieved only by living the simple values of the Constitution. The Constitution is not written in some esoteric language. It is not written in any great mystical formula. It is the simplest of documents to understand and follow. But why is it that we treat the Constitution as a book which is kept 10 yards away, but it is actually the creed of human existence? If you look at the directive principles of state policy closely, you will find, if you look at the latest edition of A History of Western Philosophy by Sir Anthony Kenny, there's a chapter on Aquinas. And you will find that some of the principles of expropriation of excess property for public good are in a certain sense traceable to old philosophy, which then comes through Marxist and Hegelian thought. But that's a separate point. The point I'm trying to make is all equality involves personal transformation. It involves change. It involves also being capable of bearing fidelity to the moment. and not be in a state of self-denial. It's just no point in saying, no poverty exists because I don't see poverty. It is just no point in saying that, actually, we are having multiple kinds of ratios to compute what is poverty line, and, we really don't know whether poverty exists. But it does exist. Can anybody say, crossing his hand across his heart, that there is no poverty? We have children who are eating in the schools a meal which is called a midday meal. I wonder how many of you have actually sat with those children and also just asked them for a spoonful of what they eat. They eat, sometimes, crushed stones. But it's an extraordinary society. While children can eat putrid matter and crushed stones in their midday meal, the cattle in Bihar will keep on eating fodder through the day and the night. It tells us that if equality were to mean anything, it must be translated by executive action. But how does executive action get demanded unless there is a vigilant civil society? When the civil society is vigilant, powerful, forceful, and capable of committee, it is able to get a committee constituted, a report in 29 days, a law reform in another 29 days. It is possible. A change is possible. But it is up to you how strongly you feel about change. Mr. B.N. Pandey, who was the former governor of Punjab, told me that when he went to the Sarvodaya ashram, the first lesson which he was taught was actually to make sure that everybody who stayed in that ashram had a clean bathroom. And he said, that was my first lesson. It was, of course, a bit devastating, but after that day, I never looked back. We all need to do something which may not be in the same measure, same kind, but we need to do something which is incorruptibly true with ourselves. And it is what you do with yourselves, you will immediately be able to accord the other person dignity. Many people think that dignity means that just as I think, the other person must think. If he actually doesn't think like me, then I'm able to actually just walk across, ignore the person. No. Our brain has enormous neurons, most of which is not utilized, even after we are gone. We are gone. But less than 0.2% of the neurons in our brain are ever utilized in consciousness. If our consciousness is so enormous, and when Professor Singh used the word galaxy, actually our brain is capable, mind you, of imagining, visualizing, and experiencing a galaxy. Neurologists, neuroscientists are getting closer and closer to see the multiple possibilities inside a brain. It has got a multilingual, it has got a musical, it has got different kinds, and mind you, everybody has capacity for genius. Everyone's brain is unique. Every single human being. The process of natural selection is so fantastic that every single person has got that enormous capacity, enormous ability to be unique. But uniqueness must be respected, discovered, tolerated, encouraged, accepted. Distinctiveness must be accepted, respected. How do you do it? Who helps you to do it? The Constitution. And therefore, we must understand that why it is political is because it is born out of free will. We the people gave unto ourselves this constitution. We the people have given unto ourselves this value of dignity, of equality, of socio-economic rehabilitation of the underprivileged. We do not have to lead the lives as propounded by Jeremy Bentham at all. We can look for more modest means, but that which actually accommodates greater quotients of our people in togetherness, in equality, and in dignity. And it is this empowerment which needs to be put into practice at an individual level and also at a collective level, at an institutional level. Now, at an institutional level, that is a big thing. But it is not very difficult. Our institutions have practiced it in the past. The lawyers whose names Professor Dinesh Singh mentioned are some of them. I'll give you 3 incidents. Motilal Setalvad. He had a very gruff voice, and he had a stentorian habit about him. And he was greeted by the Maharaja of Mysore, who wanted to engage him. And the Maharaja of Mysore brought a huge wicker basket, like the modern Deepavali basket, but it contained not fruits, it contained plenty of gems and whatnot, and he just sort of thought he was doing a great job with a silver scarf. And he brought, and Setalvad looked at him and he said, "Well," and he just offered this. And Setalvad said, that, "Are you aware that I'm a lawyer?" The Maharaja looked at him. He just bowed. He couldn't understand. "Are you aware I'm a lawyer?" Yeah. He said, "A lawyer doesn't take gifts from a client. I only take a fee. And please send it by check if you don't mind." That is the first example. The second, when Nani Palkiwala argued for the dissolution of that reference to reconsider Keshavananda Bharati. And Keshavananda Bharati's case is one which has lots of history to it. Lots of history. There were lots of people who believed that parliamentary sovereignty is immutable. How can the judges stand up and strike down parliamentary action? A lot of them were, of course, barristers trained in England who thought that, parliamentary supremacy meant you could do anything you like. But that judgment is a historical judgment because they said that once the Constituent Assembly has chosen to put together a constitution, we will have to hold that some of its essences are simply immutable. They can't be changed. Republican democracy can't be changed. Secularism can't be changed. Equality and rule of law cannot be changed. Access to judicial review, that's an independent judiciary, so sorry for you, can't be changed. But it is that judgment which has protected, shall we say, the tremendous political upsurge to do away with any obstruction, because nobody who is in power ever wants to be interrogated. He feels that, once I'm in power, why should I be answerable any more than is necessary? And today we have a declining society where even an executive is not thinking that it's very, very much answerable to Parliament, because Parliament itself doesn't sit. In 2011, we've had only 73 days of sitting. In 1950, the Parliament sat for 138 days. What does it tell you? Accountability is necessary for equality. Transparency is necessary for equality. Diversity is necessary for equality. And we must understand that diversity again will involve, recognizing diversity will again involve a process of self-negation. I'm using this word self-negation in a very positive way. What I mean to say is that self-negation means a psychological process where you expand your consciousness to give room for another person, very different, with different ideology, with different thoughts, with different behavior. But this requires this continued accountability. And lastly, the legislature. The legislature has to be alive to social realities. But to be alive to social realities, it requires a medium in civil society. And there cannot be a greater medium in civil society than students, than teachers in a university. I will not forget that in 1974-75, it is at Maurice Nagar, just a few yards away from here, when students congregated and said that we must actually have a free, unoppressive India. Students wrote chits of paper and put them in post boxes quietly. They would walk with little bags and put little chits. Please don't vote for a government which is going to stifle human rights. Please, please, thank you. Put a small handwritten slip. Students. And mind you, they were the harbingers of very successful social change. We must understand that just as in this process of collective deliberation, we're all connected in some way. We all have to be committed to making a change, and that is only possible when you look at law as an ally, not as an obstruction. You look at law as your best friend. You look at the Constitution as your birthright. What Professor Singh said, Swaraj, of course it is Swaraj. It is your birthright. Nobody can take away that Constitution from you. No policeman, no judge, no lawyer, nobody. And please remember, even practicing just one idea in it will simply revolutionize your human existence. I invite you to the challenge of change. And when there is change, remember, all paradigms of associated disciplines will also start changing. It's not only one. When a paradigm in law changes, remember, a paradigm in psychology will change. A paradigm in sociology will change. Multiple changes happen. I invite you with humility today to please look at the prospect of internal and external change. And to give you the framework of change, you don't have to go very far. You only need to look at the Constitution. I've been here today only for the purpose of beginning my process of relearning. I'm a student again. And I'm also going to walk the path and the road with you in this journey. And I will always be available to you. Thank you.